Hello, welcome to Read Through the Word, and today is Wednesday, October 16th. Today, our lesson is called Lessons in Fear, and our key verse is from Luke 11:52. This was something that Jesus said to the Pharisees. In our lesson today, we're talking about when he was talking to the Pharisees and he gives them warnings or woes. There's different woe to you about many different things, and he's giving them some warnings. And the key verse comes from one of those warnings in Luke 11:52. What sorrow awaits you, experts in religious law, for you remove the key to knowledge from the people. You don't enter the kingdom yourselves, and you prevent others from entering. So we know that there was continual conflict and tension between Jesus and the Pharisees. First, interesting, it was a common practice in antiquity for a dinner to become an occasion for moral instruction. And oftentimes people invited different teachers, different rabbis or things. People would invite them to dinner. So Jesus was invited. The Pharisees invited him to this meal, and it would not have been unusual, as I said, for it to become an opportunity for moral instruction. Now, I'm sure this is not what the Pharisees expected, or maybe it was, whether it was in good faith that they wanted to hear, or whether they were just trying to trap him in words, or whether there was a kind of a mixed crowd, some of both. It could have been. So, I just want to talk a little bit for anyone who maybe just kind of is sort of starting out in this journey. Talk a little bit about who the Pharisees were. And I know that we hear about them and we think, yep, we know who they are. They're the legalistic keepers of the law. But I just want to go through because I found some interesting things too. Around the region, there were about 6,000 Pharisees at that time. That's not like a huge number, really, compared to, the total number of Jewish people. At that time, they were teachers in the synagogues. They considered their interpretive tradition to be almost as authoritative as Scripture itself. And I'm going to read a little quote from the Archaeological Bible. The Pharisees, the party of the synagogue, were a legalistic and separatist group who strictly kept the law of Moses and the unwritten tradition of the elders. Although they were comparatively few in number, the Pharisees enjoyed the support of the people and influenced popular opinion, if not national policy. They were the only party to survive the destruction of the temple in AD 70 and were the spiritual progenitors of modern Judaism. The Sadducees were also a Jewish party that represented more the wealthy and sophisticated class. They were more politically minded than the Pharisees and made the temple and its administration their primary interest. Though they too were a relatively small group in Jesus' day, they exerted powerful political and religious influence. Also, the Pharisees basically saw themselves as like guides and heirs of the interpretive tradition for the Jewish people. They disliked that Jesus taught on his own authority with interpretations that did not match their own strongly held interpretations. And, the path to becoming a rabbi, the standards for being professionally trained and things like that, like these things were clearly laid out, and Jesus didn't do any of that. Jesus didn't have any of those credentials, and his interpretations were not matching theirs, and he didn't look like he had gone through the proper channels to have the credentials they did. So that made them angry. And just a note here too, because this can sometimes get confusing. It was to me a bit. Sometimes we just hear them say experts in the law or scribes or teachers of the law. Most of these were Pharisees, Jewish scholars of the day. They were, again, professionally trained, often members of the Sanhedrin. They studied, interpret, and taught written and oral law. The majority of them belonged to the Pharisees, but some Pharisees were legal experts and some legal experts Pharisees, but they were not identical groups. They weren't the same group. They were different. There was overlap, but they were still different groups. And that explains why, as we get into the lesson here, Jesus gives these, pretty dire warnings. At one point in Luke 11:45, it says, one of the experts in the law answered him, "Teacher, when you say these things, you insult us also." So that tells you that they might not have considered themselves maybe part of the Pharisee group or the Pharisee teaching. I don't know, but they were kind of saying, hey, don't include us in with them. So that's kind of an interesting perspective. So I titled this lesson Lessons in Fear, because I think we have two interesting dynamics happening here. We have Jesus at this dinner. He's giving the Pharisees and teachers of the law some pretty stern warnings. In other words, he's kind of saying, you have reasons to fear here because you are way off the mark. You are oppressing people. You are literally taking something that is supposed to help people and you're turning it into something that's hurting people. So you have a reason to fear here, and he's real strong with them. Let's give some examples. One of his warnings was about cleaning the cup, that he said, you Pharisees clean the outside of the cup and dish, but inside full of greed and wickedness. And he's saying, clean the cup, clean the inside, right? So Jews believed that they became ceremonially unclean just during the normal circumstances of daily life. So they would cleanse themselves by pouring water over their hands, especially before eating or whatever. And it's interesting too, it says Jesus did not wash his hands before the meal. You know that was intentional. It's not like he forgot. It's not like Jesus forgot to do a very ingrained Jewish ritual. And I think that's interesting. Did he just want to hear what they said? Was he just making a point? Perhaps. And so he says, clean the inside of the dish. Like, you're so worried about cleansing the outside of you, but what about what's in your heart? And also interesting, in Luke, it says, I believe it's different in Matthew. It doesn't use this particular term. Luke says, Jesus says, but give what is inside the dish to the poor and everything will be clean for you. The Aramaic word for cleanse is similar to the word, similar to meaning give in charity. And that could have been a play on words there. So kind of interesting that different wording. But basically he's saying, look, maybe you should think about in your heart being clean and being charitable to others. And maybe that's what will make the outside of you clean. He also talks about unmarked graves. He says, woe to you because you're like unmarked graves, which men walk over without knowing it. Now, a person who stepped on a grave became ceremonially unclean. So graves were whitewashed to make them more easily visible, especially at night. Pharisees believed that even if their shadows touched a corpse, that would make them impure. And it's almost like Jesus is saying, look, you're like unmarked graves. At least if you whitewashed it, right? Like, we know it's still like pretty on the outside, awful on the inside. But at least if you whitewashed it, at least we'd be warned of your impurity, At least we would know. At least we would have some warning that that's what you're trying to doing. And back in Ezekiel 13 and Ezekiel 22, there's also a reference to whitewash. Basically, that's used to cover a wall to conceal any weakness or corruption in the wall. And that's exactly. So in other parts of the Gospels, it says, it talks about being whitewashed tombs, like you're looking all great on the outside, but inside there's corruption. And here Jesus is saying, yeah, go ahead and whitewash it though. So at least we know, at least we can see and be warned of what you're really like inside. And I just think that's an interesting point of view. He also says, in verse 46, he says, you load people down with burdens they can hardly carry, and you yourselves will not lift one finger to help them. That verse really stuck out to me. Jesus is taking this real serious. He's saying not only are they're coming to you for help, not only do people need your help, when they come to you for help, you're saying, here's another burden to carry. I don't know. I think there's lots of ways that this could look in our life today. I think that churches need to be a safe place for people to come. And I have heard both good and, unfortunately, really bad stories about churches that respond to things in a way that Jesus would have said, you're just adding the burdens and not helping. Perhaps it's someone who's going to their church leaders with a story of abuse or mental illness or addiction, or maybe they are really struggling with a challenging child and like everybody knows this kid's challenging, okay? And maybe people are even whispering like, what's wrong with their kid? Why can't this parent get this kid under control? Or why can't this person get their addiction under control? Or why don't they just have faith and their depression would go away? Or we're not really sure they're being abused. Maybe they're part of the problem. So there are ways that churches can and we as Christians, because we are the church, right? I'm talking about individual churches and the church, all of us. There are ways that we can respond to people that make them feel like we are carrying that burden with them and saying, how can I help? How can I help? And there are also ways that we as a church and individual churches can respond that do exactly what Jesus said. Not only are you not helping, you're literally adding to the burden. Friend, let's try to never be the one who's adding to someone else's burden when they need help, when they're drowning, right? When they're struggling. I know when I'm struggling, I am so grateful for the people that say, how can I help? How can I come alongside you? And I'm sure you can probably think in your own mind of times where you have gotten that help and what living water that has been to you. And maybe there's times that you can also think of that you didn't get that and it was real crushing. So let's be that to others. And then the last one I thought was interesting is part of our key verse that he says you're basically rejecting true knowledge. You're rejecting the truth, but you're hindering others from finding it too. That was a very serious accusation, since these groups, the Pharisees, the teachers of the law, they were considered like the highest gatekeepers and expounders and instructors of the law. They were supposed to take the law and make it something that people could learn and become closer to God. It was supposed to lead people closer to God, closer to truth, closer to true kingdom community. And so that was just a very, very bold thing to say, to tell them, not only do you not teach the truth, you're stopping other people from finding it too. That was a real serious accusation. The flip side that's very interesting is that as we look later on, when it says that Jesus, there was a crowd of many thousands, and Jesus began to speak to his disciples first, and then he speaks to the crowd later. But these are the things that he tells them. It's completely the opposite. He says things like, don't be afraid. For those who can hurt you physically have no power over your soul. Don't be afraid. God knows the number of hairs on your head and watches over you. Don't be afraid. God cares for the most menial things. So sparrows were one of the cheapest items sold for poor people's food in the marketplace and were the cheapest of all birds. He also said, don't be afraid. When you have to defend yourself, the Holy Spirit will teach you what to say. Don't worry about accumulating things in this life. Instead, share it with others. Don't worry about your life, your food, your clothes. God will provide. Night and day teaching. And Jesus did that all the time. He taught to his audience because one audience was drowning in legalism and pulling others under the water with them. And he was saying, you have reason to fear. This is not right. And on the other hand, these people who, as he and other, in other times would say, they're like sheep without a shepherd. And he had so much compassion. So for these struggling people, and they're trampling over each other to hear him, and his disciples are trying to figure out who he is. And he says, don't be afraid. And his lesson to them was, I'm here. Don't worry. I'm taking care of you. Because these people were ready for the truth and wanted it. And I mean, not all of them, but in general, God saw that these people were trying to find a way to know the truth. And they were looking for the love of God. And to them, he said, don't fear. So just a real interesting contrast there. So what can we do? Be concerned about legalistic beliefs and behaviors. Be concerned about that. Address that. It's serious. Instead, take care of your heart. Trust God to take care of you. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time on Read Through the Word.